Several years ago, when I first moved to this little town, I rented a nice two-bedroom house. The town had a population of about 30,000 people, and this was due mainly to the car manufacturing plant that was the lifeblood of the town. If not for this car manufacturing plant, the town would never have that many people, and I never would have moved here. After my divorce, I wanted a fresh start. In fact, I really needed a fresh start. I began to look for a new job, and to my good fortune, the car manufacturing plant was hiring. It was grunt work, but the pay was really pretty good for a blue-collar guy like myself, who didn't mind getting his hands dirty. I applied right away, and the following week I got a phone call. They conducted a quick phone interview, then they invited me to come in for a face-to-face interview. Part of me wanted to move far away. However, this job was just in the next town over, about an hour's drive from where I currently lived at the time. In hindsight, that was okay because it meant that I wouldn't be too far away from my family. I made arrangements and I drove into town for the interview. To my surprise, they hired me on the spot. When they told me the salary, it took everything I had to contain my excitement. I tried to stay professional. I thanked the folks who hired me and got out of there. Since I was starting the new job in just a couple of weeks, I decided to stay in town for the rest of the day. I needed to explore, and most importantly, I needed to find a place to live. I checked out a couple of the potential places that I happened to drive by. Then I drove to an apartment complex that one of the HR ladies had recommended to me. It was okay, but I had never really liked living in apartments. I enjoyed the privacy of an actual house. Around mid-afternoon, I realized that I hadn't eaten yet. I drove into the small downtown and I found an old-timey diner. As I was enjoying my greasy burger and fries, the waitress, a talkative and very friendly lady named Jackie, started to make small talk with me. I explained to Jackie that I got a job at the car plant and would be moving to town soon. I mentioned that I needed a place to stay. Jackie's face lit up as she went into sales mode. She told me that she and her husband Frank owned a small farmhouse and they were looking for a renter. Her dad died a few years ago and left the house to her in his will. She was going to sell it, but Frank suggested that they fix it up and rent it out for a little extra income. I told her I was definitely interested in seeing it. Jackie called her husband, and about 15 minutes later, I met him at the old farmhouse. It looked perfect. It was an old-style farmhouse. All the land had been sold off piecemeal over the years. Now the house sat on less than 10 acres. There was a long gravel driveway that led up to the house, and in the backyard was a patch of trees and a really scenic and beautiful pond. Frank walked me throughout the house. He then walked me to the backyard and we went to the pond. The pond was about 3 acres. Frank said it was pretty deep in the middle, probably about 20 feet at least. He explained that it used to be a watering hole for the cattle that used to roam the property years ago. When his father-in-law retired, he cleaned up the pond a bit, then stocked it with various fish such as bass, bluegill, and catfish for his own fishing enjoyment. He asked me if I liked to fish. I told him that it had been a while since I had fished, but I did enjoy it as a kid. Frank said if I rented the property, I was welcome to keep anything that I caught. I was sold on the place even before Frank made that offer. We agreed on the rent, shook hands, and we sealed the deal. Just in passing, I asked Frank why the place didn't already have a renter. He told me that up until about a month ago it did. A nice young couple moved to town. The husband started working at the car plant. Things were fine for a few months. Then one month the young couple didn't pay their rent. Frank went out there to see what was going on and if everything was okay. But what he found out was that the couple had skipped town. There was a note on the kitchen table from the young husband explaining that things just didn't work out with the new job. In an envelope next to the note was that month's rent money in cash. Frank said the couple left a few items, including some furniture. He and Jackie spent a couple of weeks junking out their stuff and just posted the property for rent when I happened to speak to Jackie that day. I suppose it was just my lucky day. When the time came, I moved into the house. I started my job and found that I really enjoyed it. The hours could get a little demanding, but from my perspective, it was more money in the bank. I got along with everyone that I worked with, and I really couldn't ask for more at the time. The farmhouse was one of those old farmhouses that had a wraparound porch, and to my delight, the back porch faced the pond, which was to the west. In the evenings, when I got home at my usual time, I would sit on the porch with a couple of cold beers and just enjoy that gorgeous country sunset. It was a really nice way to heal my spirit, which I really needed. One day, on the way home, I suddenly had the urge to catch some fish out of that pond. I stopped at a sporting goods store and I picked up some basic gear. That evening, I walked the 100 yards or so down to the pond and I cast my line into the water. Frank was not kidding. The pond was well stocked and apparently no one fished it. Almost every cast brought in a fish. Bass, bass, bluegill, bass. For a while, I felt like a little boy again. Soon, this became my routine. 3 or 4 times a week, I would walk out to the pond and just unwind by catching fish. Frank told me I could keep anything I caught, but I never did. I just enjoyed the peace that fishing brought me. Everything was going great. And then, things had to take a creepy turn. One night, I was fishing the pond like usual. Just about all the fish I had caught weren't really that big. The largemouth bass were perhaps 2 or 3 pounds. The biggest one that I caught out of there was probably 5 pounds. For those who don't know, largemouth bass can get as big as 10 pounds or bigger. Those are the ones that really fight hard. And for anyone who knows, bluegill are fun to catch. They fight hard for their size, but it's not really anything to worry about. Frank told me that there were catfish in the pond, but I never used any live bait, so I never hooked one of those. Well, on this evening, as I was retrieving a simple plastic jig, something big took my bait. My $25 rod and reel combo suddenly bowed in half. For a second, I thought it might snap in two. After the initial surprise, I lifted the rod and I started to reel the giant of a fish in. It must have been a catfish, I thought. As I reeled, the thing just didn't move. Did I get a snag? Maybe it's a log, I wondered to myself. I lifted the rod in one direction, then another, hoping that the hook would free itself. Suddenly, the thing on the other end pulled back hard. I leaned forward as the tip of the rod touched the surface of the pond. "Whoa!" I called out involuntarily. As I gathered myself to reel and gain some line, the weight on the line disappeared. I thought that maybe the fish just broke the line off. As I quickly reeled in, I found that my plastic lure was just fine. Whatever it was, the hook had just popped out of its mouth. Or it let go. At the same time, I wasn't thinking anything paranormal. I was just pissed that I lost out on a big fish. I made a few more casts, then I called it a night. The next day at work, I kept thinking about the fish that got away. Any guy out there who's ever been bitten by the fishing bug will understand. So on the way home, I stopped at the sporting goods store again. This time, I picked up a bigger, sturdier rod and reel setup. I even picked up some live bait for catfish. I was convinced that I had hooked a big catfish by accident. This time, I was going to hook one on purpose and land him. In fact, a catfish dinner sounded pretty good now that I was thinking about it. For 3 nights in a row, I set up my catfish pole. I landed a few nice channel cats, but nothing huge. They certainly weren't big enough to bend my pole in half. I really wanted to catch that big monster that teased me. I remember clearly that it was a Friday night. I didn't have to work overtime the next day, so I took a 6-pack out to the pond with me. I was enjoying the beautiful night. As I leaned back to finish my 4th beer, the catfish pole got hammered. It bent in half and nearly flew into the pond. I dropped the empty beer can and barely caught the end of the rod. "I got you now, you big bastard," I proclaimed excitedly. I lifted the rod high and began to fight with the fish. It pulled hard, but this time I had a much beefier rod that was designed for big catfish. I braced for the pull, and then I got back into the fight by reeling down. It was a stalemate for a few minutes, but then I began to gain ground. "Come on. Come on," I called out. A powerful swish just under the water surface caused huge ripples and a splash. The fish was coming. Inch by inch, one rotation of the reel after another rotation, I was gaining ground. Carefully, I stepped forward to the water's edge. By now, the sun was behind the trees, leaving a beautiful reddish sky that faded into a deep purple behind me. I started to go down to one knee to try and grab the fish with one hand. Stupid me, I didn't buy a net. And that's when I saw it. Or at least, that's when I thought I saw it. Maybe I should just say that's when I thought I saw her. Just under the water's surface was the face of a woman. I immediately let go of the fishing pole as I stumbled backwards. The rod and reel clanked on the rocks by the edge of the pond. Then the whole thing immediately went into the water. And just like that, everything was still again. Not counting my heart, which was now pounding at 100 miles an hour. I hesitated, then I elongated my neck, and I looked at the water again. Nothing. It was just the dark greenish water that it was before. There was no fish, and there certainly was no woman. Suddenly I didn't want to fish anymore. I left all of my gear. I even left the 2 unopened beers. I double-timed it back to the house. As I sat in the living room that night, I watched TV, and I tried to clear my mind, but nothing really worked. Did I really see a woman's face in the pond? Maybe? Fish don't look like that. But it had a face. However, I did drink 4 beers on a mostly empty stomach. I was feeling a pretty good buzz at the time. It couldn't have been. I'm sure that I was just mistaken. By the time I laid down for bed, I was convinced that I didn't see what I thought I saw. I couldn't have. The next day, I spent almost the entire day out and away from the house. I caught a movie down at the old cinema. I bought some cowboy boots for myself, since I now lived in a farmhouse. I figured it was appropriate. I got dinner, then I even got ice cream. But since it was another clear night, I did get home just before sunset. I had no desire to fish again, but I did want to enjoy that sunset. I sat on the back porch, and it was beautiful like usual. A couple of nights later, I worked up the nerve to walk down to the pond and clean up my mess from the last time I fished. After that, I sat on the back porch to enjoy the view, but I didn't fish again. Time passed, and I'd forgotten all about that face in the pond. Over a month later, I was sitting on the back porch again, enjoying another sunset, when I noticed something really odd. There was a person standing by the pond. From this distance, it was hard to tell, but it looked like a woman. Either way, she was trespassing. I decided that I should go check on her. Maybe she needed help, and if I could help her with something, then I would. And if she was trespassing, then I could ask her to leave. Without taking my eyes off of the woman, I began to walk. As I got closer, I could see now that she was definitely a woman, with her back to me. She was petite, and she had shoulder-length blonde hair. She was wearing a pair of black shorts and a blue t-shirt. Her clothes looked wet. It was almost as if she fell into the pond or she just finished swimming. As I got closer, I called out to her, "Hi there. Can I help you?" There was no response. "Miss, do you need help? Did you fall into the water? You really shouldn't be out here." Again, the woman didn't respond to me. I got about 20 feet from the woman. Then I stopped dead in my tracks. The hairs on my neck stood up on end. Something felt wrong. There was a cold sensation that actually shot up my spine. "Miss, do you need help?" I called out again. The woman slowly turned and faced me. Her face was young and pretty, but she was disheveled. And there was a blank look on her face. She had big blue eyes, but those eyes looked, well, the best way for me to describe it is they looked dead. She had some sticks and some leaves that were in her hair, and her entire body, including her hair, was definitely wet. "Honey, did you fall in the pond? Do you need my help?" I offered. At that moment, her pale lips mouthed the words, "Help me." There was no sound, but I understood. "Okay, miss, don't worry," I started to say. Then the scariest thing I ever saw in my life happened. That little blonde girl tilted her head back, and her entire head folded backwards. A gash in her neck that ran from one earlobe to the other earlobe opened up. The only way I can really describe it is to think of a human Pez dispenser. That girl's entire neck opened up for me to see. I saw her esophagus, every artery, every vein opened right up. I even saw the whites of her neck bone. When you see something like that, if you're a slow thinker like me, it takes a second to process. But once it hit me that I was seeing what I saw, I turned and I ran. That was the night that I learned I can't run very fast in cowboy boots. Slipping, tripping, falling, then getting up, I made it back to the farmhouse. I was certain that that girl and her horrific flipping head was going to be right on my heels. However, when I turned to look, I saw nothing. There was no sign of her anywhere. I immediately called Frank and Jackie. Frank told me to call the police, which I did. He said he would be out there soon. Shortly after Frank arrived, one of the local cops pulled up. Both men looked at me like I was absolutely crazy. But then Frank admitted something. Frank said that my description of the girl's appearance was similar to the young wife who rented the house before me. Frank explained to the cop, then gave him some info on that couple. Both men had me walk out to the pond with them and show them where I had seen the girl. I was definitely spooked, but I did what I was asked. The cop left to do some investigating. I packed a duffel bag and I went down to the Motel 6 for the next couple of nights. When I came back to the house about 2 nights later, I was greeted by about a half-dozen police cars, a medical examiner's wagon, a fire truck, and a ton of other official-type people. Frank and Jackie were there too. Just about all those folks were by the pond. I joined Frank and Jackie on the back porch. Frank proceeded to tell me that the cops looked into that young couple after the night I saw what I saw. It turned out that the young husband had been arrested in California. His wife was missing and presumed dead. Her family had become concerned when they hadn't heard from her. Cops in California suspected the husband immediately. The husband confessed but refused to say where her body was. When our local cops did their inquiry, then shared what I had seen, everyone thought that it was strange and completely crazy. However, a request came in nonetheless for the local cops to check the pond. That evening, just before I arrived, a diver located the remains of a young girl who had been tied to a concrete block and dumped into the middle part of that pond. I'll be damned, was all I could manage to say. Frank and Jackie were nice enough to give me my deposit back and let me break my lease. The following week, I moved into that apartment complex that the nice HR lady had originally recommended to me. How I really wish that I had done that in the beginning. One day, I walked into the diner. Jackie was my server. As I was eating, Jackie told me that they finished the autopsy on that girl. It turned out that she died because her throat had been cut from ear to ear. I immediately choked and coughed on my bit of fried fish.